How's it going, everybody? Welcome into the SFS channel. My name is Gavin, and in this video, I'll be breaking down my top 30 wide receiver tiers and rankings for this week, Week 14 fantasy football here. As always, these rankings are subject to change. If you want to see how those changes look throughout the week, you can check that out on my website, sizzlefantasy.com. There's a link in the description of today's episode. But as always, if you're new around here, drop on down, smash that subscribe button, turn the bell on. It helps me out a lot and helps grow the channel here. So thank you guys so much for your support. And with that being said, let's dive right on into our first tier here for Week 14. All right, as I said in the intro, these are going to change probably throughout the week with injury-related news and other stuff. So if you want to check those out, sizzlefantasy.com, as I mentioned. Otherwise, code SFS on Underdog Fantasy. Sign up and deposit $10 or more. That's going to get you access to all of our exclusive content on the website through the end of this fantasy season. So first tier here, we run through this very quickly every week. These are the best of the best in fantasy football, and there isn't too much debate that needs to be had because we can all agree that they're top 5 players. Justin Jefferson this week at Detroit. That's a matchup where he actually underproduced in the first matchup this season, but I still believe is very exploitable. He's been on an absolute tear. Devontae, talk about an absolute tear. Since having his kind of blunder performance a few weeks back, he has been absolutely killing it. Him and Derek Carr have got a deep ball connection in Las Vegas that I never saw through his 7 or 8 seasons in Green Bay. So that's been extremely exciting to watch here. He's got the Rams this week. Jalen Ramsey has been absolute burnt toast this season, so that matchup doesn't really scare me too much. And then Tyreek Hill arguably has the largest level of variance and fluctuation in what his week could look like. This week he's at the Chargers. Tua's ankle, though, is that situation we're talking about here. Hopefully he can play. I expect that he will be out there. That may not be the case, though. I don't want to try and blow up the situation and make you guys scared, but that's obviously a factor that could be in play here. So Skylar Thompson might be on the radar this week. Again, though, that's not something we're currently talking about, so honestly, I've spent too much time talking through that situation. He should be able to succeed very high, or at a very high level in this matchup this week. Tier 2 here, another tier that doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. You've got Jamar Chase this week taking on the Cleveland Browns, game 2 back after the hairline fracture in his hip. He had 97 yards, catching 7 of 8 passes in game 1 back against Kansas City. A.J. Brown absolutely cooked his former team Tennessee last week. 2 touchdowns, over 100 yards. It was a monster performance. He's got the Giants this week. Not a matchup that scares me too particularly much, but every once in a while Jalen Hurts will zone in on Devontae Smith, and that obviously makes AJ's floor a little bit lower than some of these other elite tier wide receivers. For CeeDee Lamb here this week, he's got the Houston Texans. The one concern I have in this matchup, CeeDee's been absolutely balling, playing high-level wide receiver 1, alpha-level football as of late. But in this game, if he isn't a part of the party that I expect to get a big lead out in front for Dallas this week, there is a chance that they just salt this win away here, sprinkle in some run game, and just wind down that clock. It's a very small concern here, but he could very much so have himself a monster first half, and the rest will be history. Stephon Diggs, my actual first real concern here of any of our top 7 wide receivers for this week. He's got Sauce Gardner, the New York Football Jets. If there's any corner in the league that I'd be scared of right now, it would be Sauce Gardner. He has been very, very solid, as was a DJ Reed across the other side of the field. Not as big of a name, but someone who's been playing some really good football for the Jets this season. So their secondary, their defense as a whole has been holding opposing offensive players, especially those number 1 wide receivers, below their typical fantasy averages. So keep an eye on that, though. It's Stephon Diggs and Josh Allen. The ceiling is always there, of course. And then Amon-Ra St. Brown here at number 8 versus Minnesota. The last time we saw these two teams square off, Amon-Ra had a down game. However, he suffered an injury in that game. Do not forget that. So there's some context behind those lessened numbers. He got off to a good start, then turned his ankle funny, and then things that, the train kind of came off the tracks a little bit. I'm expecting much better numbers from a healthy ARSB here in this week's games. All right, tier 3 here, we still have some absolute stud wide receivers in this grouping. We've got 6 teams on bye, so it's kind of shocking to see this still play out the way it has been. We've got the Colts, the Commanders, the Packers, the Falcons, the Saints, and the Bears. That was hard to do off the top of my head. All on bye week here for Week 14. So obviously missing a handful of fantasy relevant names between those teams. DeAndre Hopkins, though, kicks us off here at the number 9 position, taking on the Pats this week. Typically what we've seen throughout this season is high-level quarterback and wide receiver play has gotten the best of this Pats secondary and prevailed over the defensive stoutness of Bill Belichick's scheme. That hasn't always been the case, though. And for Kyler Murray in this offense, they've struggled at times this year. So it'll be an interesting dynamic here. Hopkins is still Hopkins. We've got that dynamic and chemistry going on. The ceiling is there. We'll see how the floor fares in this week's matchup. DK Metcalf, Himothy himself. This guy has been absolutely insane this year. Him and Geno Smith, who would have thought, it's definitely not me, that the Seattle Seahawks would have a deep ball passing game surviving throughout this season. I mean, one of the things I was most critical of in the preseason this year was the fact that Geno Smith, at the time it sounded crazy, was going to be the starting quarterback for this team, and he has balled out. The NFL actually just made like a highlight post of Geno Smith's deep balls to DK Metcalf here. It's been a great situation. I mean, DK has thrived. Obviously, he is a beast of a wide receiver as a physical and just dominant, imposing threat here. This guy has got everything that you could want. So from a ceiling perspective, and even his floor has been much better. Honestly, his target volume has been even better than it was with Russell Wilson in this season alone here. But for DK against Carolina this week, definitely an exploitable matchup. I expect Seattle's offense to have success here. Jalen Waddle at Los Angeles. Now, he got banged up a bit in this past week against San Francisco. I believe he actually entered into that game with some sort of an injury designation and then continued to get beat up through that game. This is a matchup, though, if he can come in healthy and just make the most of his opportunities. We know what Jalen Waddle is every single week in terms of his ceiling. The floor has always been the question. And two, of course, we talked about the ankle injury. Obviously, that could play a factor here. Hopefully it doesn't. Jalen Waddle just needs a couple of catches and off to the races he goes. T. Higgins here, finally, our wide receiver 12 against Cleveland this week. He has been looking better and better with Joe Burrow here. Now that you've got Jamar Chase taking back that number one coverage and getting that safety shade attention, single coverage, man coverage matchups have been just an absolute feast for T. Higgins. And I expect him to continue to eat up those opportunities here and be a low-level wide receiver 1 going forward. Tier 4 here, we've got ourselves 5 really exciting players. So talking through that same Carolina matchup with Tyler Lockett here, he has been phenomenal this season. Just getting open underneath, sitting down immediately. This guy literally is like on a mission to not take a shot this season. Every time he catches the ball, he just immediately sits down or is taking it off to the end zone for a touchdown. But very, very exciting stuff from the Seattle offense. As we touched on, Carolina's defense is exploitable. And of course, you've got the fact that Carolina's offense is just inefficient and may struggle to produce points against this team, which is kind of a streaky defense. But nonetheless, Seattle's offense should have plenty of opportunities to provide success for both of these wide receivers. Deebo Samuel in a really interesting scenario here with Brock Purdy as his quarterback. I think if any receiver will sustain success with Purdy, it is Deebo, because I think he can do a lot of work at the line of scrimmage and get a lot of those freebie passes out in space going in the other direction for obviously positive yardage downfield. So for Deebo, it's going to take more volume. It's going to take a lot of those freebie passes we saw him get in 2021, and that obviously hasn't been as of much of a constant for 2022 here, but maybe we see that trend back in favor of his direction here. Amari Cooper, completely dependent on quarterback play this week. By the way, Deebo has Tampa Bay this week. I expect that to be a relatively low-scoring game. Amari Cooper here is completely dependent on Deshaun Watson and the quarterback play there. Obviously, the rust was evident last week against his former team, the Houston Texans. This time out here, he's got Cincinnati. They are going to need points to win this football game. Hopefully that serves Amari Cooper well. Keenan Allen, Miami this week for him and the LA Chargers. Mike Williams reportedly back at practice. He will not make the tiers today, though, spoiler alert, just because that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to play. So as I said, this is the top 30 as of Tuesday evening, so this is subject to change. If it sounds like he's going to play, obviously he'll crack the rankings. You won't see him in today's episode, though. Keenan is a rock-solid wide receiver, too, dependable. You can rely on him. Made a really nice play down the sideline to score a touchdown, 49 yards, I want to say, in the Week 13 matchup. Garrett Wilson here. I am incredibly bullish on him as long as Mr. Mike White is the starting quarterback for this team. Robert Saleh is getting my blood pressure up here talking through Zach Wilson. The goal is to get him back on the football field sometime this year. Now, fantasy football owners, we do not want that to be the case. Garrett is looking like a potential league-winning player as your wide receiver 3. There's a lot of ceiling here. He had 2 touchdowns in Week 12. Week 13 he comes out, has 162 yards. This guy is a pure number 1 receiver. He's at Buffalo this week. That defense, their secondary, it's been hit or miss here, but we're expecting perfect weather as of right now in Buffalo for that game, so no excuses for Mike White here. This should be a controlled environment in which Garrett should be able to have some solid wide receiver 2 success this week. Just 3 names in this next tier up here. Chris Godwin taking on San Francisco. The reason he doesn't make the tier above is simply the matchup. San Francisco is incredibly difficult. I talked through this. I think that they're probably the most difficult defense to go up against from top down in the National Football League right now. He actually had a touchdown call back on Monday Night Football. Should have been the game-winning go-ahead score, but it was a holding call, pretty bad on Donovan Smith there, saying like a bad hold on his part. So hopefully Godwin can continue to get his volume and continue to sit down in the holes in the zone coverage, get intermediate crossing routes from TB12, but if there's a matchup he could struggle in, this is definitely one of those. Christian Kirk at Tennessee this week. The weaker part of this Titans defense is the back end. So Christian Kirk, obviously the number one volume producer for this offense, could have some success here. I'm optimistic about his outlook for this week. There is, of course, the chance that he does bust because every once in a while this offense just combusts upon itself. But I do think if the volume comes and the opportunities are there, this is definitely a matchup he can exploit. And then Hollywood Brown in that same New England Patriots matchup, I like him as the more vertical threat in this offense, as a big ceiling play to potentially go out there and spurt some high scoring numbers for you. I don't have the greatest amount of faith in his floor for this week. He again is kind of a boomer bust option. I see as the number 2 option to DeAndre Hopkins now. He's no longer the wide receiver 1 in town for Arizona. So keep that stuff in mind, though. I would definitely still start him as a lower end number 2 this week, though. Starting out with tier number 6 here, this is where things for me start to take kind of a downward slope. So Devontae Smith is definitely someone that I would say has a really nice fantasy ceiling. He's extremely talented. His route running is fantastic. Obviously a former Heisman Trophy winner for a reason, and a high first-round draft pick by Philadelphia in 2021. He can get the job done. He can go out there. He can, make a lot of damage happen, but A.J. Brown's the alpha receiver in Philly. So every once in a while, you're going to see Devontae Smith just have a stinker because he is going to, him being Jalen Hurts, lock into A.J. Brown. Now, we've also seen games where these guys coexist. We've seen games where Devontae Smith outscores A.J. Brown. So it's really hard to predict the kind of outcome that's going to be every week in this Philadelphia offense, but it is a very high-scoring team, so that you have going for you. Mike Evans here is absolutely someone highly on my bust radar for this week. To be honest, the fact that he's in tier 6 and my wide receiver 22 is really just because of name value and ability level right now. The production has not backed up anything whatsoever that he's done this year, or that we expected him to do with the amount of passing volume in Tampa's offense, and it's been really frustrating. It's been really disappointing. I actually think he should have caught a touchdown, a long touchdown pass in the fourth quarter for the first, I think, of the 2 scores for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers coming back against the Saints, but he decided to flop and get the PI call as opposed to trying to fight through the receiver and making the catch. But regardless, Mike, I've said this literally like 3 or 4 weeks straight, has not scored a touchdown since week 4. We're going on 10 straight weeks without touchdown production, which is what this guy in the past has been known for, aside from his 1,000-yard seasons consecutively, which for fantasy purposes are kind of arbitrary in terms of their results to producing elite fantasy scoring potential. So Mike Evans, I'm getting fed up here against San Fran. High level bust alert for him in this week's matchup. DJ Moore, every single week is on a similar bust alert, level playing field here because of his quarterback play, but his ability level is there. He is the true alpha number 1 receiver in his offense, and his ceiling has proven to be a lot better than Mike Evans throughout this year. DJ's got Seattle on the road this week. Seattle has allowed a lot of yardage to opposing receivers as of late and has allowed teams to move the ball really well in between the 20s. They have been very opportunistic, though. Sam Darnold, being a relatively sloppy quarterback at times, might have himself not a handful, that would be a lot of turnovers, but he might slip up and have a couple of turnovers in this game, and, Carolina could struggle offensively because, as I said, Seattle's defense is fast, they're young, they're opportunistic, and they ultimately make you struggle in the red zone. So, things to think about there. That was tier 6. 3 names up here in tier 7, starting with Juju Smith-Schuster at Denver. Now, for Juju, he is a really versatile player. The reason that I still have him ranked inside of my top 24, and he is 24th, despite the really tough matchup, is because they can move him around the formation and they can give him the ball in space and get him yards after the catch. We really saw Kansas City's offense struggle a bit last week, and that trickled down to Juju Smith-Schuster and his overall impact on that game. But I do think here I consider him healthy and that his ailments, especially his head injury, are no longer impacting him. That's a good thing here. If he can catch the ball out in space, run, maybe find the end zone, you've got yourself a wide receiver 2. If not, he's a respectable flex level player this week. Jerry Jeudy, the first player I have in that category for obviously being, outside of my top 24, so being in that flex range here, is Jeudy against Kansas City. Now, I'm expecting Kansas City to score and outscore the Denver Broncos, so the Denver Broncos are going to be in a position where they're forced to pass. Kansas City's defense has not been super strong against the pass, as we saw last week against Joe Burrow. Obviously, he cut them up when it counted the most, and they don't seem to be pushing much resistance back against opposing offenses. Now, this Broncos team is atrocious offensively, so really this is just me kind of laying it down on hopeful volume and the fact that Courtland Sutton's going through a hamstring problem right now, which are absolute pains to deal with and really impact wide receivers especially. So expecting an increased workload for Jerry this week. And then Deontay Johnson against Baltimore at home. Kenny Pickett's been looking better. The floor has been steadily rising for Deontay. It's nothing to write home about, but it has been noticeable, so I will notice it and acknowledge it in this video here. So hopefully in a matchup where it's Pickett versus Tyler Huntley, sounds like Lamar's going to miss this week with a strained PCL, we can rely on Deontay Johnson and that Steelers offense to maybe have more time of possession than normal if the Baltimore offense struggles here. And obviously, this Deontay Johnson situation could result in a flex level performance. So now let's get started with the 8th and final tier for today's episode, kicking it off with my wide receiver 27 this week, Josh Palmer against Miami. As I stated earlier, Mike Williams is someone that I'm still pessimistic in terms of his availability for this week. That charts Josh Palmer into the number 2 wide receiver role for this week. So I like Palmer in this matchup. I like Palmer basically every week that he's playing in a relatively important role for this Chargers team. He looks really good out there. His routes, his hands, his dependability for Justin Herbert. The production doesn't always come, but the last 3 weeks he's had a fairly respectable floor. He also had the monster ceiling game in there as well. So for Palmer, it's kind of hard to predict. He is a really solid player, though. It kind of frustrates me how much Justin Herbert's been spreading the ball out because he's not necessarily producing high-level fantasy players despite his talent and caliber of a player, but Palmer deserves to be in this top 30 ranking evaluation. I've got Brandon Ayuk one spot below him simply for the fact that Brock Purdy is playing quarterback. Now, it seems like Brock Purdy is getting a whole lot of praise out there this week, and I'm not necessarily here for it just yet. I'm still skeptical of his ability to make throws to the most traditional and pure wide receiver on this team, the most natural route runner of the group, the guy who works the middle of the field 15 to 20 yards downfield. So I don't know if he can make the same throws Jimmy Garoppolo can make. I'm not saying Jimmy's Patrick Mahomes here, and I'm not trying to make him seem like some, amazing quarterback, but I do think that Jimmy was very good for what Brandon Ayuk did in this offense, and it obviously showed throughout the last month plus of the season. So I'm going to be a bit pessimistic in a game that I think is very low scoring. First career start for Brock Purdy. Tampa Bay's defense has been playing well. Their offense has been playing poorly. Obviously, poor offensive football against 2 solid defenses. Again, low scoring, low production. Could be a strugglesome scenario for both of these teams here. Adam Thielen in this 8th tier here against the Detroit Lions. Again, an exploitable matchup. Thielen is very touchdown dependent at this point in his NFL career. He would not be in my top 30 had those other 6 teams, if you missed out on who those were. It was the Commanders, the Colts, the Bears, the Packers, the Saints, and we're missing one team that I'm not going to sit here and think about for 5 minutes, but those were the majority of them. If those teams were playing this week, Thielen would not be in the conversation for a flex level spot, but with the ease of the Detroit matchup, the struggles they have in the secondary, and Thielen's still relative dependability for the offense of the Vikings, I'm not saying for fantasy football, but in terms of the ease of the matchup and obviously hoping he can score a touchdown this week, he makes our tiers. And then Gabe Davis here. He is streaky and touchdown dependent as ever. Has the Jets this week. A tough opposing matchup. I don't have a ton of faith or confidence in him this week. Obviously, again, against Sauce Gardner and that tough, stout Jets secondary. He scored a touchdown last week, but mustered 2 receptions for a whopping 15 total yards. Very underwhelming stuff there, and obviously where the root of my pessimism comes from and the reason I have him down here at the number 30 spot despite the circumstances. So there you guys have it. If you guys enjoyed today's episode, smash that like button. Those were our top 30 wide receiver tiers and rankings for this Week 14 slate of games. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. As always, our running back segment is out today as well, so go check that out after you're done watching this episode, and I will see you in a future video. Our Week 14 playlist is live on the channel, as well as, again, if you want to have these tiers updated throughout the week and have personalized lineup advice, sizzlefantasy.com or Underdog Fantasy using code SFS. Sign up, deposit $10 or more. You'll get access to me helping you out down the stretch of your season through the most pivotal time of the year, the fantasy football playoffs, whenever you need. So thank you guys so much. I will see you in a future episode. Peace out.